Good evening and welcome to Slam the Gavel, the show that tells all regarding family court, other court issues, as well as CPS. I am your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me, my books, and blogs on dismantlingfamilycourtcorruption.com, as well as on Amazon. I have another announcement. Please notify your Attorney General in your state regarding solar panels made by Sonova or Generac Systems. If you're having difficulty with this company, fill out the form in the Attorney General's site in that state. Okay, I have a return guest. I'm really happy to have Attorney Kim Korven back on. She was last on season 5, episode 200, where we talked about divorcing with peace. And today we're going to talk about how a lot of people don't see the abusive behaviors coming or coercive control. I welcome you back, Kim Korven. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Marianne. It's wonderful to be back. We had such a great conversation the first time. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, me too. There's a lot people don't realize when they're in a relationship what the coercive control is and abusive behaviors that they don't take seriously.
Well, and they're marginalized. So, and of course, we're also taught, oh, did I do something wrong? Seems to be our go-to response
Mm-hmm.
um, from long before we're with these partners, right?
Right. Right. We make excuses. Even if the relationship you think is going well, you might just make excuses for, maybe you're in traffic and it's kind of crazy and you say something like, "Oh, you're supposed to yield here." And then that person just blows up at you.
Well, and there's that. And even I remember dating a fellow who turned out to be a stalker. That's
Mm-hmm.
and And during the relationship, and I was about a size 6, and he's like, "Oh, calling me fat." And I'm kind of like, "Did I just hear that?" And it was, "Oh, you don't want to believe it, but you don't realize that it leaves a weight on you."
Mm-hmm.
And and there were other things like, "Oh, well, this could be a little better." Very, very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
And it was more of a feeling like, what is going, like, what?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, oh no, that can't be.
Or he or she didn't mean it that way. We always
Yeah,
make excuses.
we do make excuses. Oh, he's tired. Oh, there's this. And it can literally be that subtle. And sometimes even it's not that subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like it's this constant barrage, or even telling the kids, oh, you got a bad mommy.
Mm-hmm.
Your mommy's stupid.
Yeah.
And and I think part of it, Marianne, is it starts with this disbelief,
Uh-huh.
and
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes normal. And 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 I think part of the disbelief, there's the disbelief, there's the how do I raise this? Especially if somebody has a temper, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah, the temper is a very scary issue because people don't take that seriously as well. Oh yeah, they just threw something across the room. Well, it only weighed 1 pound.
Well, and even like I was meeting with a woman last week, and they haven't been together for years. They haven't resolved things,
Hmm.
but they'd kept money in a joint bank account and he
Hmm.
cleaned it out. So she was, yeah, they'd been separated for years. The joint bank account was family property and he cleaned out the account. And I was suggesting one response to her, and she was, oh, no, 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 I can't say that. He's going to have the kids. And that told me there's abuse there still,
Mm.
right? That subtle.
It is. Um, for example, back when I was in nursing school, I was dating this guy, and my one friend, she was like a second mother to me. But she told me later, after I ended the relationship, that she had seen both of us in the grocery store. And she said, I could tell there was abuse there. It's like, how did you know? She says, I just felt it. I could tell. I won't go into that part, but
Hmm.
it was like it was subtle, coercive control, verbal abuse, and it was getting a little bit more rockier than that. And I was lucky enough to end it there.
Hmm. Well, I know, like with the stalker, it was like I remember when I ended it, and I didn't see the abuse. One of my coworkers always referred to him as the weenie,
Hmm.
right? Because I think she could see the dynamic. She saw the dynamic for what it was. And so when I ended it, I had gone to my parents' place out of town. I came back, parked my car in front of my office, like I worked in an office tower.
Hmm.
I did some work. It was a Sunday afternoon. And it's so long ago, of course, we didn't have cell phones. And I was just doing a walkthrough to make sure I turned the coffee maker off. Came back to my desk and my message was flashing. And I checked it. He'd left a message. So he was patrolling out, he saw my car in front of on a Sunday afternoon when he didn't live downtown. So it was, and that completely, like that was just like,
Oh, yeah.
and I think that's when I started to get a sense of this guy's not right, this relationship. Ooh. But it really didn't sink home until Valentine's Day when a gift arrived for me at the office. And there was no card on the gift. And my sense was, oh my, OMG, he got me a gift and we've broken up. Like, the alarm bells were just going off in my in my body. And some of the women in the office, and I share this, right? Because sometimes people, they were like, oh, it's a present, open it, see what it is. You
Mm,
should keep it. And I'm like, no freaking way.
no.
Right? Like my gut, I listened to my gut. And after work, the colleague who always referred, well, what I did too was this was before privacy laws, and my firm represented a courier company. And I'd worked with the owner. So I
Hmm.
phoned him up and said, hey, I got this package delivered here, and I was clearly upset.
Hmm.
Can you find out where it was picked up? And it was picked up from this guy's place of work. So after work, my colleague, who always called him a weenie,
Hmm.
we went to the police. And I was really fortunate because the police officer ran this guy's name and discovered that a previous girlfriend had made a complaint about him.
Mm.
So the police officer actually told me what I had to do. And it was everything of yours he has, do not try to get it back.
Hmm.
Everything he ever gave you. And he gave me like a really expensive watch. And because I think that's part of the abuse. It's the abuse and then the really nice acts, which makes it hard to see.
Hmm.
Like a really expensive watch. It all went back. And he had been storing his bicycle at my place. It all went back. And I took a friend. The police were supposed to be there with us. They weren't. And one of the things the officer had told, like, I had to hide my car. He was change the locks, hide your car, all of these things to stay safe. And he also told me when he phones, um, just hang up, do not even say hello. And so when my male housemate was away on a ski trip, my phone rang at 7 o'clock one morning, and guess who it was?
Mm,
Right? Like it was, and even I moved from that city. Um, well, I found a job that was my dream job,
mhm,
but the real impetus was I couldn't be there, right? Like I just, that was a big part of it. I did not want to be around him. And even a year later, I'm at this training event, and people there said to me, "Oh, so you're friends with," and they mentioned his name a
mm,
year later. And I'm like, like he was still asking about me.
mm,
So, I mean, I was really lucky
mhm, mhm,
to get out and to have that police officer tell me what I needed to do. And so I've actually, like, I've used that experience since then, not just in terms of telling women what they need to do,
mhm,
but also in terms of credibility. If there's a problem, sometimes you're better off calling the police first on a proactive basis
mhm,
because they're more likely to believe you. So then when the other person calls, they're like, no. And so I've done that with clients too. Um, with a client whose former spouse was, I'm phoning the police that you've kidnapped my kids,
mm,
right? So
mhm,
telling my client, okay, you need to tell them the history. You need to have them look at this guy's file and say, here's what he's saying. So then you don't have the police banging down the door,
mhm, mhm,
right? Because we tend to get into this fear mode and not take any action,
mhm, mhm,
right? And it would have been, I would have been much more traumatized if I hadn't gone to the police after I got that gift, if I'd waited for it to get more serious.
mhm.
And I'm saying more kind of in quotation marks because it was serious. But in terms of how our society, how our system views harm, it wasn't serious at all, right?
Mhm.
And that's part of the problem of seeing the abuse. It's, well, if you don't have a mark on your body, is it abuse?
Right. Because verbal abuse, emotional abuse, even child psychological abuse, they don't take this seriously.
No, no. And it's, and when I think about kids, what I'm discovering more and more is that children, the emotions of the parents are the children's emotions. They're not separate. So the psychological abuse is actually, it's really, really damaging. And kids don't have the language to talk about it,
Hmm.
but we see it in their behavior. And I've always remembered Dr. Nadine Burke Harris's TEDx talk, and I recommend it to a lot of people. But she was a pediatrician at the time in the San Francisco Bay Area, and she was seeing all of these patients, these kids with ADHD.
Hmm.
And she was like, what is going on? It can't be something in the water. Like, there can't be
Hmm.
something wrong statistically to this number of children.
Hmm.
And that's when she discovered adverse childhood experiences, right? So you have, of course, and I've looked at the ACEs since, and there's actually a correlation between emotional abuse, emotional neglect, and attempted suicide as an adult. And, you know, a parent with mental health issues, a parent who overconsumes a substance doesn't have to be an addiction. They say divorce is an adverse childhood experience. I don't think it's divorce, it's conflict.
Hmm.
Because when parents divorce peacefully, the kids do better. If they've been exposed to conflict and the conflict goes away, they do better.
I agree.
Yeah. But our system is still set up that 19th century rational model. What can you measure? Well, you can measure the bruises on a person. And even in terms of the physical abuse and divorce, well, of course, it used to be rule of thumb. A husband could beat his wife with anything smaller, with a stick that was smaller around than the thumb, and that was okay.
Hmm.
That's where rule of thumb comes from. And the wording of divorce in the British legal system is like if physical or mental cruelty to an extent that renders continued cohabitation impossible. And it was a judge who made the decision,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So if the judge didn't see it as excessive, too bad, so sad.
Hmm.
Put up with it. You're not getting divorced.
Definitely, I can totally relate to what you just said. Because i- people of my age, when you go to tell your parent and let them know you're getting divorced, I was screamed at, and my mother said, "Well, as long as he's not drinking and beating you, you don't have a problem." Well, it's like, no, I do have a problem because there's other issues going
Well,
on.
and that's the other thing. Like my parents wanted me to get divorced, but then when I asked my husband to leave, there was no emotional support from them. And I think it's that same mindset that, well, you're supposed to. It's till death do us part.
Oh,
Like, what are you
you're not
doing?
kidding.
What are you doing? Which lends itself to us minimizing, even the sideways looks or the sigh when we say we want to do something.
Hmm.
Like, no, no, because over time that can wear down your spirit.
Hmm. And it does. One of my friends had told me she she was a nurse I worked with. I was telling her some stuff. I had already been divorced, but I was telling her stuff, what was going on. And she goes, "Boy, you were dying on the vine.
Yeah.
You're slowly becoming a hollow shell of yourself."
Well, and when you become that hollow shell, it's really hard to make the decision,
Hmm.
right? Because your self-esteem is in the toilet. Because I remember, you know, doubting that I would be able to support myself and my kids financially.
Hmm.
And I was an attorney.
Hmm.
And what was really funny, like I used to the first couple of years after I asked him to leave and I'd run into people, Kim, what happened to you? You look so much younger. Well, I left my husband. And even one fellow, he'd been an old a client years earlier when I was still married. And I saw him like 10 years later in a restaurant. So I went up and said hi. And he said, "You look familiar, but I can't place you." And I'm like, "Oh, it's Kim Korven. "Oh, you look so much younger." This is 10 years later.
Hmm.
Like we we don't recognize ourselves at all. And I think there's a tendency, of course, when we initially leave and when we start to recognize things for what they are, our tendency is we want to shout it at the rooftops.
Mm,
This was abusive. This was abusive. And then you get slapped down by the legal system.
mm,
And there's, and what happens is divorce was put into the civil law system, which was designed for contract and property disputes where there's not a lot of emotional attachment. And it's adversarial. And how the game is played is you admit to no weakness. You take no responsibility. You point fingers at the other side. So let's say you've bought a used car
mhm,
and then the engine goes out of it. So and the person who bought it, who you bought it from, refuses to reimburse you, right? Like the engine goes out in the first 2 weeks. And you're not saying, well, you never checked the engine. You're not saying, well, you tested it to see just how fast you could go. There's none of that.
mhm,
You're simply saying you sold me a piece of crap and you knew because XYZ.
mhm,
And the defendant doesn't say, well, I was worried about the engine. That's why I was trading it in.
mhm,
The defendant says, no way. No, no, no. You must have driven the crap out of it. I've got mechanical records to show that I got it fixed. And it's a much more objective. You don't have to keep having a relationship with this person. So the stakes aren't as high for your heart. But when that happens in terms of family law and divorce, and and you realize, OMG, he was emotionally abusive to the kids. I don't want him to see the kids. And so you put that in the pleadings. You want to have sole custody, sole parenting, sole decision making. And you're saying what a horrible parent he was. You're sharing those examples.
mhm.
And of course, this is somebody who you loved once. So he feels completely humiliated. You end up with World War III.
Mhm,
And the other thing with people who are abusive is they need to win.
mhm,
They really need to win. So if you do that in the public forum of the court system, they are going to crush you. And part of what happens is when you're dealing with a property or a contract dispute, it's much easier. If you have an issue, usually, like let's say you have an ongoing relationship with a supplier, there's going to be documentation expressing concerns before you get to the court process. So there's this consistency of behavior. And that's how you gauge credibility. That's how you're believed, right?
mhm,
And in a contract dispute, you're much more likely to have that. And I know when I was an adjudicator of landlord and tenant disputes, and when I used to do professional conduct investigations for CPAs, I always look for the document trail
mhm.
because much more reliable evidence, right?
Mhm.
Before the dispute started, before it got to court.
What was the pattern?
Yes, that's what you look for. That kind of consistency. Is there a pattern? What's been happening before? Because of course, once the dispute starts, there's an expectation that you're going to throw mud at the other person. So yeah, you're looking what's the evidence from before there was this active dispute? Well, in an abusive relationship, the only evidence is he said, she said,
Mhm.
right? Because how do you, if you don't recognize it, if your very survival depends on you not recognizing it, how can there be any external evidence?
The thing is, with even trying to show a pattern, as we did, the judge didn't care.
But what was the pattern? How are you trying to show the pattern?
Well, the pattern was, for 10 years, we co-parented with no problems. No one was doing drugs or alcohol until I remarried. That's when hell broke loose. But in the interim, he had married a woman that worked in the courthouse. And that's also when the problems started. So it was very uh,
Well,
vague.
and it also points to the fact that the legal system is problem focused.
Hmm.
It's on fixing a problem. And the why, and it's strictly the legal issues. So it was between you and him. So your relationships, they don't matter.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying it's right, but it was interesting too. Like when I think about back to during the COVID era and parents having different opinions and vaccinations, and sometimes the kids or he's and it's and it was always until there's a problem, we can't do anything. We can't be proactive. The court system is not proactive.
Hmm.
And it gets to measuring harm too, right?
Right.
I'm thinking of your situation. Like, how do you measure harm? What's accepted as harm?
I don't think anything was. When we were going to the courthouse, my attorney said, don't bring up any domestic violence. And I thought, well, there really wasn't because I really, like we had talked earlier before we popped on, and I had told you that he raised a fist to me, and he also in the kitchen did that with a knife.
Mhm.
And I didn't consider that. I just didn't somehow consider that abuse in some way. Maybe it was so normalized with being verbally abused, I didn't take it seriously.
Well, I think there's more and more. I'm thinking, women were always property
Hmm.
or for a long time. And I forget the legal term, but essentially, when you got married, it was like you just were swallowed up by your husband, your identity,
Hmm. But
you
another,
know.
right?
And that's part of why, like in criminal court, a wife couldn't be compelled to give evidence against her husband, right? She
Right.
was just part of him. So if that's what our norm is, our normal way of being for hundreds of years, changing the laws doesn't change what's underneath it.
Hmm.
You know what
Also,
I'm saying? Yeah.
right, right. Well, and then what was going along with that law, I can't think of it either. But since a woman was the husband's property, that say she was in a store and she stole something out of the store, then he would have to answer to that in court. Which, and I was telling my current husband this, and I said, women are technically back then I would be your property. I was trying to joke with him. And he goes, oh, I said, but just think if I went into Sam's Club and I stole a couple of items and I got caught, you'd be held accountable for my actions.
Well, and in the United States, it's just over 50 years ago that a married woman could have a credit card in her own name without her husband agreeing to it. And in Canada, it started like 10 years earlier that women had those rights. But so it's not that far away.
Right.
So you're right about our mother's generation experience. Like it's not so bad. Like, come on.
Mhm. Yeah, I didn't tell her the other gruesome things he was telling me because I if I wasn't getting that support, why continue the conversation?
No. And I think that's the other thing. When we can tell we're not being believed, we don't share.
Hmm. Hmm.
And and in this world of rationality and physical symptoms and tests,
Hmm.
so if you're feeling off about your relationship, first of all, who do you talk to? And and where you go. And I'm rereading Glennon Doyle's book, Untamed,
Hmm.
and of course her chapter on jobs.
Hmm.
And she goes to her therapist about like, I'm really not enjoying sex with my husband. He's been unfaithful for years
Mm.
and the therapist says to her, well, a lot of my clients,
Hmm.
right? So not looking, it's that just put up with it.
Oof. I saw a meme. Well, actually, it's on a calendar from like 1950s women. And one woman says, I don't put icky things near my mouth. Not happening.
Yeah. Right. But it's like, so if you're in that space, it's real, if you're not getting the support, there's not going to be the evidence that satisfies a court.
Right. And then the court turns on the Darvo on the victim, the deny attack, reverse victim offender. And that's happening all the time. Even if there wasn't abuse, if they want to pin something on you, they're going to do it.
Well, it's like I remember a client I had like 25 years ago, a legal client, and she was needy, like really, really needy, and second guessed everything I did, right? And had a really tough time making a decision. I mean, she was not like she was demanding,
Mhm.
um, and came across kind of flaky. And we've stayed in touch over the years. And I also remember and became, friends on Facebook. And
Mm.
her ex sent me a friend request. And I told her this, and he's sending friend requests to all of my friends. And that's part of, you see that in abusive relationships. And now looking back, I go, this was a coercively controlling relationship
Hmm.
because her behavior, that's what happens to victims of coercive control. That's how they show up. And in terms of that credibility standard for the court doesn't realize that when you have one person who's very charming and very articulate, they're going to be believed, even if they don't have a high level of specificity
Hmm.
in the facts that they share.
Hmm.
But they're easy to listen to. Whereas the victim, is not. But the victim usually has a high level of facts. And it's only in my mediation practice since I started learning about coercive control about 6 years ago
Hmm.
that I've started seeing that pattern. And what's interesting in, I've also discovered that those people who are controlling, who want to be liked, who want to win, sometimes they actually like to do mediation with me because then look at to the world, I'm doing the right thing,
Uh-huh.
right? And that won't happen after, like if you're crying from the rooftops, abuse, 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 and you hire a lawyer right away and start the legal process, then you're done. It's going to be a really horrific battle.
Hmm.
But if, when you realize this is abusive, quickest, best way through this is can be mediation, isn't always, because if you play the game the way that the legal system is played, no. But I'm always trying to figure out how can both people win
Hmm.
and actually doing the best alternative to a negotiated agreement analysis and helping people get really clear on what's most important to them. So when you have somebody who really needs to win, you as the victim need to poke a few sticks.
Hmm.
You need to, like, I'm going to back up. The thought, of course, when you've been in an abusive relationship is, I'll just be reasonable and then he'll be reasonable or she'll be reasonable. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because they have to win. And winning isn't being reasonable, winning is putting you down. So you need to start asking for more than you want. And you also need to say that some matters that you don't care a lick about, but are very important to this other person, they have to be on the table. So then you can be making concessions that they're paper concessions, but really they don't matter to you.
Hmm.
So you're more likely to get a good result in what matters to you. And I've had clients mediation like this where he gets really mad at me and is sending abusive emails to me. And she's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Kim." And I'm like, "No, no, no, don't be. This is actually really brilliant
Hmm.
that I've become the enemy because it creates more space for the two of you to work together and solve this,
Hmm.
right? So you cannot play the game in the traditional way. So you work out the deal and then go to attorneys. So basically, you're bypassing the court system as much as possible, the lawyers as much as possible, and you increase the likelihood of a good result.
I agree. I wish more people would do that.
Well, this is why I'm here to spread the word
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's so much healthier for kids. And in terms of you've been in an abusive relationship, then it's easier to heal from it
Hmm.
because you're not re-victimized in the legal system. And it's part of why I have the group program for moms called Unshackled,
Hmm.
right? Because it's getting moms to a place where, okay, I understand the legal system. I know how I have to work in it. I know how I have to set up negotiation with this person. And it's peer support with other moms going through it. And it isn't a victim focus,
Hmm.
because life is hard and we are thrown challenges all the time. But it's having the right support to be resilient through it. Because it doesn't do you or the kids any good if you see yourself as a victim.
Hmm.
And the other thing is, if you're saying bad things about the other parent, they use it against you.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts the kids in the middle. Well, like when I have clients and dads are being, it's clear that something's happened when the kids are parented by dad, like the kids come back and their behavior is off the charts.
Mm-hmm.
It's to have the conversation with the kids about, hey, do you like my behavior all the time? And to share a real life example. Well, I lost it on you in the car or when you were getting dressed or whatever. Do you like my behavior all the time? No. And do you love me? Yeah. Well, you can love me and not like my behavior. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's normal. And it can be the same with dad, or it can be the same with mom. Because I think what's really confusing for kids and for us is we think, oh, if I love this person, I have to like all their behavior. No,
Mm-hmm.
you can love the person and not like all the behavior. I'm not saying but, I'm saying and.
Mm-hmm.
They're not. And it makes it easier then to recognize what's going on and to stay true to you. Because there can get to a point of time, oh, this behavior, I can't put up with it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're still acknowledging the love, there's less need to think I have to destroy this person. When in reality,
Mm-hmm.
if you've been the victim of abuse, you're going to get destroyed most likely in the court system. And
Right.
it isn't, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the people in the court system, but the court system was set up in an era when women were property for these rational, logical property and contract disputes in an era when everyday people weren't educated, didn't have access to good information themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So the world has changed, and really the legal system hasn't. So there's this disconnect.
And it's really huge because when you brought up not to badmouth the other parent, they were constantly blaming me for this when we weren't doing it. We did not. I mean, I did not badmouth him. My parents did not badmouth him. The kids would actually come to me and say, all dad is badmouth you when we're home.
And
I said,
what would you say to your kids?
I said, well, I don't badmouth him, right? And they said, right. And I'm thinking, why am I getting blamed for this all the time?
I just say, I am so sorry your dad's putting you in the middle. I know you love him. This has to be really difficult for you.
Actually was so shocked I didn't know what to say because I was in the thick of it. I was actually
Yeah.
fighting for my life. I was just stunned. All I said
Mhm.
was, "Well, I don't, do I?" And he said no. And I said, "Okay, what do you want for dinner?" I just
Well, I
continued.
know, and that's likely because we're not taught how to do that. And there's a fine line between bad mouthing the other parent. Like that's what I really like about that you can love him and not like his behavior,
Hmm.
right? Because you're acknowledging the love. And also, if you say, you don't like my behavior all the time, right? This is just part of being human. And I'm really sorry dad's behaving this way
Hmm.
because that has to be very difficult for you.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Because, right? Because then it acknowledges, oh, okay, right? He's your dad. You're always going to love him. I remember saying that to my daughter when she was
Uh-huh.
10 and didn't want to go to her dad's. Like, no.
Mm,
And that's actually when I came up with the, you don't always like my behavior, do you?
mhm, mhm,
No. Okay. Well, and you're not always going to like your dad's. And you love me, right? Yeah. And you're always going to love your dad. So you can go. You can be parented by your dad. It's important you have a relationship with him. And it's also important, I think, as a parenting strategy, like kids need to face hard things too,
mhm,
or they don't grow, or they don't learn resilience. And to be exposed, like what I actually told my daughter that time was because she was complaining about they always have macaroni and cheese on Tuesdays at 5:30
mhm,
and pizzas on Friday, right? Like it was just boring. And I'm like, look, kid, you know, with me, we can eat anytime between 5 and 9, and
mhm,
it might be a bowl of cereal.
mhm.
So, what's happening here is you're being exposed to two very different ways of being. And that's a really important life skill to have. So, it's really valuable for you to be parented by your dad for that reason, too,
Mhm.
right? Because that's the other learning. When, so parent is bad mouthing mom, right? And to say, I'm really sorry you're going through this. And what do you need from me to help you get through this, right?
Mhm.
How can I support you?
Well,
Because I can see, you're going to have friends doing this too about other friends.
mhm,
So can we work out a strategy here, right? So that you don't end up feeling caught in the middle. Because this is something that you might be able to use with other relationships as you get older.
mhm.
So you turn it into a learning. But to acknowledge, yeah, this has got to be really tough for you.
A lot of parents don't know. This is why I'm so glad I have you on because I didn't know what to say at that time. If I could go back in time, it's just so hard to uh,
Well, and it's
give
and
advice
and
at that
and
time.
and I don't know where it comes from, but
Mhm,
I always, and maybe it's from the higher power. I suspect it is, but I always seem to know what to say um, to help kids. So, for example, when I was still with my first husband, and we had to, we were going on a trip, and our sewer had backed up that morning, and he fixed it, and we're in the cab going to the airport, and he burst into tears. Um, and his thought process, I think, was, I'm being punished for going away and having fun. Like that's where his mind was at the time.
mhm,
And and I'm just acting because I'm living completely in my head. I'm acting like nothing bad is happening. All is well, right? Like this
mhm,
is what we do. Because I'm like, I don't know what to do. What in the heck do I do with this?
mhm,
And so we get to the airport. He goes to the washroom to pull himself together. And our son was 6.
mhm,
And he said to me, Mom, why was Dad crying? Why is Dad crying? And my heart is just like, how the F do I answer this? I don't know what to say.
mhm,
And what came to me was I said, honey, you know how the Corvins, we have issues with our hearts. Okay. Everybody has issues, right? And so the Corvins, it's issues with our hearts. Everybody has some health issues with our hearts. Well, your dad and your Baba, they cry more than most people.
mhm,
That's their issue. It's okay.
mhm,
And that's what I said. And it calmed him down. And I share that because if any of your listeners are in that place, what do I tell my kids? Like I do offer a 1 hour consult where that's all we'll do is we'll figure out what do you do in that circumstance? What can you tell your kids? So you can be true to you and help your children experience more peace, even with a really, really difficult, with lots of issues, lots of complications with the other parent.
Mhm.
Because, and as I say, I don't know where it comes from, but it is a superpower of mine.
Mhm. It's like you have to be thinking on your feet.
Well, but it's thinking and it's connecting to your heart and seeing the world from the child's perspective. Yeah.
Mhm. Well, when you say that, I remember when I was living in England and there was a commercial. I had like a 2-year old, and it was a commercial on heart medication. And she said, "What's that for?" And I said, "Oh, that's for people with bad hearts." You know what I mean? And she
Mhm.
said, "Does that?" She said, "Is that for people that can't love?" And it's like, "Oh, that's deep." I said, "No, it's just
But
their hearts aren't working right."
but kids get it.
Right.
Like we think they don't. And my son, I remember when he was 7 by then, and we had a dear friend who was elderly, who dementia was taking over.
Mm,
And he had witnessed an outburst from her that was, that needed to be dealt with. And I forget what I told him, but his response, and my kids called her Granny, he said, "Oh, so it's like Granny's brain is broken."
mm,
And I'm like, "Yes, that's exactly it. Granny's brain is broken." And then he could be at peace. Okay.
mm,
He taught me a lot, my son, when he was little.
mhm.
Yeah.
There's a lot of insight to these kids that it's being destroyed in the family courts.
It's
When,
not being acknowledged at
right,
all.
right.
And and I mean, and part of it is the family court system. It's designed for legal issues, not families. Legal issues are at the center,
Mm,
not the family, right?
right.
And that's what I mean about it was set up for property and contracts,
I agree.
where, where the dispute, the legal dispute, is at the center.
Hmm.
And really, if we want healthy kids, we need to have family at the center of the family court system, and it needs to be more than legal issues. And what's really ironic is I love the law
Hmm.
and I love equity. Equity is all about fairness.
Hmm.
Okay. I love it. However, the way the game is played was a very dangerous place for me because when you want to focus on more than legal issues, but that's what the rules say you must focus on, it's a dangerous place.
And other people have said there's no family in family court. There's it has nothing to do with family.
Yeah. And I mean, the people in the system would deny that. But the other thing, I mean, and not everybody who goes to law school is a conceptual thinker.
Hmm.
I am,
Hmm.
right? And at one stage, because I'm a conceptual thinker, I was invited to come and do my master's and become a prof.
Hmm.
I'm a conceptual thinker.
Hmm.
I see behind the surface, right? So most people who are legally trained wouldn't be talking about the history of divorce, wouldn't be talking about how evidence, what they're looking for, about credibility,
Mhm.
none of that. The other thing about the legal system is it's like, and I briefly mentioned in terms of COVID cases, it's not proactive,
Mhm.
right? So you're always looking over your shoulder. So you're tweaking the system instead of going, okay, we're 21st century. This is the reality, right? Like this was the reality when the system started. This is the reality now. Does it fit? What does current reality, even current reality, if we were starting fresh, what would we do? I don't see that analysis. I see tinkering.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I mean, lawyers could play a really vital part in the system, in a revised system, in terms of more sharing information. And if they were asking people, what do you want your life to be?
Mhm.
Okay, well, so these legal issues, how do we, instead of this, you've got to be a zealous advocate for your client
Mhm.
and protect them against worst possible legal harm. Most people don't care about worst possible legal harm. And the other thing is, even if you win in the legal system, nobody's happy
Right.
because the underlying interests aren't taken care of.
Mhm.
So I've always remembered. So when I went to law school, of course, I was super obnoxious because any friend who told me about a problem or family member, I would say, oh, you got to hire a lawyer and go to court. Because I thought, this having a judge decide, this objective person, that was the best, right? It was objective. It was so clean. And I was so excited when I got to do my first trial. And it was a small claims trial. And my client had told me when we first met, yeah, and it was all about who would pay for materials on this fence, on this yard. My client owned the trailer, somebody else owned the land. And he told me, first time we met, that his daughter and grandkids lived in that trailer and it was a busy street.
Mhm.
So we go to court. The other side brings one of the boards from the fence as evidence that has a knot in it. And I'm like, what do I do? What do I do with this evidence? Like I was
Oh.
freaking. But we were successful. And I'm thinking, justice has prevailed. This is so good. Yay. But guess what? My client was so upset.
Mm.
And he was wanting to appeal. The judge didn't hear me.
Mm.
And 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 he was wanting to appeal. The difference between the order and what my client wanted was about $100.
Mhm.
And my client was wanting to appeal. And I'm like, what is going on here? You won, justice prevailed. Like it
Mm.
was just like I'd been slapped in the face.
Mm.
But then I remembered that first conversation, and I was able to say to this gentleman, why did you build the fence? I don't know, right? He couldn't think of it. And I said, wasn't it to keep your grandkids safe?
Mhm.
And then there was silence. And he said, yes. And then he was fine with that decision. And what I learned from that was once the legal dispute got rolling, it had nothing to do with what was important to him. That was completely lost. So when he won, he couldn't be happy until it was brought back. Oh, yeah, his underlying reason. Oh, yeah, okay, this is fine.
Mhm. Yeah, sometimes,
And,
yeah, reality. You have to point out reality.
but there has to be, I think, if we were to have a new divorce system,
Mhm,
you can't lose touch of what's important,
mhm,
of what's most important. Because then that's the proper measurement of do you win or lose. And I think part of why people get so frustrated with lawyers is because there's that disconnect. So there's no value added,
right.
right? Because it's not connected to what you really want.
These lawyers, well, these family court lawyers are very adversarial. Like, for instance, I had a female lawyer, and I didn't know that she had put a motion in for full custody, and then she dropped my case right before an emergency petition where my ex wanted to take only one child away out of two. So anyway, I had to hire another law firm. So when I sat down with that lawyer, he said, You guys created a war. I said, What war? He said, Well, you're asking for full custody. I said, I'm not. I said, We had been 50-50 for 10 years.
See, and so here's what happens. And here's but here's what happens with the legal system. So when you start a legal action, it's basically you have one kick at the cat. You have one opportunity to say what legal issues you want to raise.
Hmm.
And if you don't raise them then, it becomes incredibly difficult to raise them later.
Hmm.
So when the lawyer has this professional obligation to protect you against worst possible outcomes, the first thought is I have to check off all of these boxes. We have to do it now. So a client really has to be vigilant and able to say, and this is part of the training that I share with my clients individually and in Unshackled, is to say no. Because as a mediator, I have seen that too. And
Hmm.
I just want to go like face plant because it makes settlement so difficult. These things that aren't issues at all for the people involved, they are resolved, leave them off the table
Hmm.
because it just creates increased animosity in the other side, right? It
Right.
just makes it harder. But because of this, you need to raise it. You can't raise it later.
Hmm.
They stick it in.
Well, when I
I've seen
told
it before. Yeah.
when I told him, I said, I never said that because, like I had said, we had been, 50-50 for 10 years. And he said, I don't believe you. I said, Well, that's the truth. And then several weeks later, we had another discussion. He says, I believe every word you're saying. And he also said he goes around town cleaning up all her messes. Well, he tried to clean up my mess, but that wasn't going to work either. But I think to show that pattern, why didn't she put in, say, hey, they were 50-50 for 10 years? There's nothing.
Well, and the other thing is a lawyer, like every time they send an email or a letter to the other side, they're supposed to be copying you.
Yeah, I didn't get that copy. I don't.
And every time and before they make the claim, they are supposed to discuss it with the client because the client gives the instructions. So, for example, when I took the separation agreement I prepared to my lawyer,
Hmm.
and it didn't mention custody and access, it just said I was the primary parent. She had a fit and was not going to let me sign my agreement. This is what she said to me,
Hmm.
right? Because it left me too exposed in the event once there was a dispute over parenting time, I would never be able to enforce the way the agreement was worded, right? She told me, I'm not going to let you sign this agreement. Well, guess what? I know what a lawyer's job is. I know what the client's job is. I give the instructions. Thank you very much.
Hmm.
So I said to her, Can't you just prepare a letter that says I'm signing this against your best professional advice and that I can never sue you or the firm
Hmm.
if things go sideways? She wasn't happy about it, but she did it. And I remember being incredibly angry signing that letter. And I thought, right, but she had the obligation to tell me and to
Hmm.
share her professional opinion. It was up to me to decide yes or no if I was good. But what my gut told me, if I did what she said, we would be fighting in court for at least 5 years over where the kids would live. That
Mm.
was my gut. Um, and I thought, like I was angry signing that. And I thought for the average person who's not part of the system, they're feeling like a failure. They're not trusting their judgment. They're
Hmm.
going to go, oh, well, I'm paying you and you're the expert. Even though my gut's saying something different, I better do what you say. And then there'd be a war. And of course, part of it, and I mean, I'm a strong personality.
Hmm.
So was my was my first husband abusive to me? There was a lot of sighing about me doing things. I don't think um I wouldn't characterize it. There were moments. It wasn't a big pattern though, right?
Hmm.
Um, so for somebody who's been in this abusive relationship, who isn't used to speaking their truth, who does what they need to do to keep the peace,
Hmm.
they're going to do what the lawyer says, and then things go offside.
Quickly.
Which is right, which is why I like to intersect with people before they've started working with lawyers. Because, of course, the other thing about the legal system not being proactive, it wasn't the legal system going, oh, well, we better have laws in place in case people's marriages end and do it at a theoretical level. It was happening.
Yeah.
So they did it in response. So it's actually a series of life questions.
Hmm.
And when people can think about it that way, like where will our kids live?
Hmm.
It's way less intimidating. It puts the power back with the parents. Oh, how are we going to provide for our children financially when we're living in separate homes?
Hmm.
It's a much different energy to that question than child support,
Right.
right? Because the other thing about the legal system is there's almost a presumption that one person is going to want to harm the other person, screw the other person over, or there's only so much of the pie.
Hmm.
The pie is very small. You know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Right. We had negotiated all that. Um, we had just gone to lawyers just to get the divorce papers going, but we negotiated what, um, the child support thing. And he asked me if I needed spousal support, and I said, no, that's stupid. I'm
Mm-hmm.
working. I know I'm working part-time because I've got to run these kids to the doctors and dentist appointments. I said, I'm
Mm-hmm.
just afraid. I've never had my own house to live on my own. It's just scary. He said, what? And then we came up with our own figure for child support, which was incredibly low for someone of his salary of a vice president, right? But I said, that's fine. And then I also negotiated that, okay, so if I buy this farmhouse, you've got to help me install a new kitchen and two new bathrooms. Because I did a lot of hands-on work myself too. I was laying
Mm-hmm.
tile and I enjoy that stuff because I was doing it my way. And he did help. And we worked together well on that until these other parties came in to
Yeah.
play.
Well, and exactly, like that's a beautiful resolution.
Hmm.
And like I've worked with couples who've kind of agreed to the amount of support, and then working with me, he agrees to more,
Hmm.
right? And it's not out of any kind of coercion or you must,
Hmm.
but just having really fruitful discussions.
Hmm.
Okay. And over being able to do things together with the kids
Hmm.
creates more feelings of goodwill.
Right.
And sometimes too in the negotiation, and this is why it's can be important to work with somebody who can facilitate a good conversation, is to talk about, well, what happens when you get new partners?
Hmm.
Because if you have that discussion, things are less likely to go off the rails when you do get new partners.
Hmm.
And this is part of treating it as a life event first. So when you have everything negotiated and you need to paper the deal
Hmm.
and you go to attorneys, then you can say, like I did, no, no, we've agreed to this. This is what's happening.
Hmm.
This is how the agreement has to be. Thank you for sharing your legal opinion.
Hmm.
But, and even the fact that we've been doing this successfully for 3 years, 5 years, we don't need to. And so, for example, when it came time for me to divorce, I phoned up my lawyer and said, okay, prepare the divorce documents. I said, all I want in the judgment is divorce. I don't want to refer to where the kids live or child support or division of property, none of it. We're getting along well. That would just stir up negativity. And I think she'd learned from working with me because all she said was, are you sure, Kim?
Hmm.
I said, yeah. Okay. So
Hmm.
my divorce, my interaction with the court, the separation agreement was attached to the divorce petition. But all I asked the court for was to dissolve the marriage. So it was really low key,
Hmm.
low conflict. And I mean, and the other thing with my divorce, and I mean, in the relationship between my former spouse and my son when we were together was really rocky.
Hmm.
Um, really rocky.
Hmm.
But my goal was always I wanted my kids to have the best relationship possible with their dad because he's their dad.
Hmm.
I was confident they'd have a really good relationship with me. And I also somehow, my inner knowing said, if he gets help, it'll take about 5 years.
Hmm.
And that's what happened. Like 4 years after separation, he contacted me about taking our son on a trip to London and Paris. No, I said, right? Like it was like, there was still, my gut was like, no. But when he asked a year later, I said yes, because things were much healthier.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, funny you should say that because my ex wanted to take the kids over to the UK. And I was okay with that. He said, "Could you meet me at the post office they're getting their passport pictures and you need to sign off." I said, "Oh
Yeah,
yeah, I'll be there." But the kids look sullen or flat affects. And it's like, "Oh, you get to go see where I live." And I'm part Welsh anyway. So I, I said, "Go have a good time in my country," And
yeah,
so they all went and I think it was just for like a week and a half.
yeah,
But when I was working evenings, I get a phone call, and my ex is calling me because the middle one would not settle down. He was just crying, wanting to go home. And I said, "Well, what did you do with them today?" "Well, we went to see this castle, that castle. We went here, we went there." I said, "Okay, but you got to remember, these are still little kids. These are kids
yeah,
under the age of 8. They can only tolerate so much walking around. I mean, this is a lot of walking around. These castles are huge. This is where
yeah,
really rich people live." Okay. I said, "This is what." So I'm talking to my crying son, and I said, "It'll be okay. You'll come home in a couple days. Don't worry about it. Just try to go to sleep. You'll have fun tomorrow, and just don't worry about it. Okay." So then I put him back on the phone, talked to dad, and I said, "Look, just don't run their legs off. They're tired. They get tired. You know? But that's
But you
just
know, that's so beautiful
mhm,
that you were able to do that.
mhm.
And even the fact that things broke down, your kids experienced 10 years of really effective co-parenting,
Right.
right? And it's to be able to, as I say, I think it's really important to have the conversation. It's not a legal issue,
Mhm.
but to have the conversation. Um, okay, so when we get new partners,
Right.
right? What's most important? And who comes first? And I know, like, when I met the man who became my second husband, I actually had a goal. Like, one of my things was my kids came first.
Hmm.
And if he couldn't accept that, well, there'd be somebody else would show up.
Oh, I agree. I was very demanding of I any guy that met me, but my current husband, he's got to be able to be accepted by the kids. He has to almost um just I don't know what to say. I want to say fill a void. I don't know. That's the only thing that's coming to me. Because my youngest really loved him and the boys gravitated to him. You know,
Hmm.
they all three of them liked him. So it's like, oh, okay, this is great. And my current husband doesn't have kids of his own. So it all went very smoothly, and it has been
Hmm.
with my current husband because he has I'm putting my kids first. He knows I put my kids first. He also has to put my kids first. These aren't even his kids, and he's
Yeah.
got to put them first. And he did. I was lucky. I was totally blessed to
Well,
find this one.
but but it isn't luck. It was that was one of your non-negotiables, whether you
Right.
expressed it or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing to do with luck. And that also, I mean, kids are drawn to the light.
Mm-hmm.
Adults are drawn to the light. You know, like if you've got two people and one is well, one is Eeyore,
Mm-hmm.
right? And one is Piglet.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you want to interact with? Piglet.
Mm-hmm.
So it's being that positive force and not false positivity, right? Like if we get back to that, yeah, you don't always like my behavior, but and you love me.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be the same with dad. And this is so tough sometimes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You're being the light.
Very true. Very true. Uh, so I'm so glad I had you on. I'd like to have you back on again. I could talk to you all day, and I don't want to suck up all your time.
It's fun though,
Isn't
right?
it?
Like
Oh yeah.
and and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and really the opportunity to talk so much about kids today.
Hmm.
Because a lot of people look at me and go, "Oh, you're a former attorney." Um, but it's kids that light me up and you know, creating peace,
Hmm.
a space where parents can create more peace for their kids. Because I think, oh, can you imagine the world if more kids experienced peace in their homes?
Mm-hmm.
What would happen in the world? And it doesn't matter. It can be like because parents who stay together, there can be so much conflict because passive aggressive behavior and the silent treatment, that's
Hmm.
conflict or going through divorce or post divorce. But it's like if kids experience less conflict, there'd be fewer issues at school. Kids would learn more effectively. They'd be more self confident. Very, very positive changes. And that lights me up. So thank you
Well,
for this
thank you.
conversation.
No, I'd like to have you back on. And if people need to reach you, do you still want them to go through gentlewaydivorce.com?
Yeah, that's, because there's a link there to book a consultation
Okay,
because
cool.
I offer a free 20-minute consultation. There's also like there's lots of good resources under the blogs, under the tools. Even there's the how do I tell my husband I want a divorce and keep the peace,
Hmm.
which I charge a nominal amount for. But it's a really great way to start the process,
Hmm.
to minimize expenses and conflict,
Hmm.
even in really challenging relationships.
Hmm.
So yeah, gentle way divorce. It's easier than trying to spell my last name.
Oh, well, hey, don't jump off, okay? Uh,
Okay.
Slam the Gavel's a podcast, help the public understand what really goes on in these courtrooms. I'm your host, Maryann Petri. You can find me on Spotify, YouTube. Please like and subscribe, Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google, and other platforms I don't even know about. Again, feel free to buy me a coffee to help keep this podcast going. Thank you so much, Kim Korven, for all your good advice. I totally appreciate you.
Well, thank you for having me back. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, I did too. Thank you.